I can make you do anything.
Je ne sais pas parler français. Arrête! I love you. Never leave me.
Once upon a time, in the bustling city of Los Angeles, lived Calvin Weir-Fields, a novelist. He had many successful books, but recently he had been struggling with writer's block. One night, while sleeping on his couch, he had a dream. In that dream, he saw a beautiful lady with ocean blue eyes and engaged in a brief conversation with her. When he woke up, his writer's block had disappeared, and he knew exactly what he wanted to write. He rushed back to his typewriter and wrote, Ruby Sparks, 26 years old. Raised in Dayton, Ohio. Ruby got kicked out of high school for sleeping with her art teacher. Ruby can't drive, doesn't own a computer, always roots for the underdog, and Ruby is complicated. The next day, when Calvin returned from his morning walk and went to the bathroom to freshen up, he noticed some women's products in his bathroom cabinet. When he came downstairs, his brother Harry showed him a bra lying on the couch and teased him about it. When Susie, Harry's wife, opened a drawer, she found panties and bras in it. Calvin claimed he didn't know anything about it and suggested his dog must have dragged them in from the neighbors. In the evening, Calvin showed his new writing to his brother. Harry commented that what Calvin had written was an idealized imagination of a woman he desired, but not a reflection of reality. He insisted that real women are complicated. After Harry and Susie left, Calvin resumed his writing, engaging in imaginary conversations with Ruby in his mind.
Were you disappointed when you got to know me?
How can you ask that?
He wrote all night and eventually fell asleep. When Harry called him in the morning for a meeting he was supposed to attend, Calvin hurriedly woke up, realizing he was already late. As he descended the stairs, he unexpectedly encountered Ruby in the kitchen. She said to him,
I missed you in bed last night.
Calvin freaked out, believing he was going crazy and seeing things. When Ruby touched him, he panicked and fled upstairs. He called Harry and told him, Ruby is in my house. She's exactly how I wrote her, and she thinks we're in a relationship. Harry responded,
Look, there's no possible way that Ruby's in your house because she's not a real person.
He advised Calvin to leave the house and visit a friend. As Calvin was leaving, Ruby intercepted him and insisted on going out with him. Calvin still considered Ruby a product of his imagination, believing no one else could see her. He instructed Ruby to stand by the road and then left to meet a friend. While Calvin was conversing with his friend, Ruby arrived and, upon seeing Calvin with another woman, became upset. Calvin's friend inquired, Who is this girl?
Hi, I'm Ruby, Calvin's girlfriend. I don't think we've met.
Realizing that others could also see Ruby, Calvin was completely taken aback. On the other hand, thinking Calvin was seeing other girls besides her, Ruby grew overwhelmed with anger and departed. Calvin chased after her, eventually calming her down, and they shared a passionate kiss. Calvin accepted Ruby as a real person and began treating her as his girlfriend. He later met his brother and explained the situation, but Harry remained skeptical. Calvin then brought him home to meet Ruby. Harry still suspected that Calvin was playing a prank and had hired an actress to portray Ruby. Calvin asserted, Believe it or not, Ruby is real. Harry proposed a plan. Calvin should write something about Ruby, and if it came true, she was genuine. Otherwise, she was an imposter, and they would contact the police. The brothers went upstairs, and Calvin wrote, Ruby speaks super fluent French, although she has no awareness of it. As soon as he finished typing, they heard Ruby speaking fluent French from downstairs.
C'est très chaud, mais je pense que l'on devrait manger.
Harry could hardly believe his eyes. They laughed together, unable to comprehend what Ruby was saying in French. Calvin promptly returned to his typewriter and typed, Ruby speaks in English. When he returned to the room, Ruby was speaking in English. They had dinner together, and as Harry was departing, Calvin urged him not to share this with anyone, and he professed his love for Ruby, promising not to write about her again. After Harry left, Calvin locked away his writings about Ruby, vowing never to write about her again. Calvin's mother invited him and Ruby for the weekend. During the weekend, they enjoyed time with the family, but Calvin experienced some jealousy and annoyance, as Ruby was finding enjoyment independently of Calvin. Upon returning, they resumed their life together. However, Ruby began to feel isolated and bored, as Calvin was frequently engrossed in reading books. She commented,
You don't have any friends.
Calvin responded,
I have you. I don't need anyone else.
Ruby felt the pressure and loneliness, so she joined an art class to combat her boredom. She also spent some nights in a separate apartment to experiment with having a life beyond Calvin. When she returned one morning, Calvin told Ruby that this experiment isn't working. Ruby said, there has to be space in the relationship, otherwise we are the same person. She emphasized the need for space in their relationship. Calvin became increasingly obnoxious as Ruby pursued her individual growth. One evening, Calvin prepared dinner for Ruby, but she opted to stay with her art school friends and informed him that she wouldn't return home until the next day. Feeling left out and entirely alone, Calvin retrieved his writings about Ruby and began altering her character. He wrote, Ruby was completely miserable without Calvin. Upon finishing his writing, the phone rang, and it was Ruby. The voice on the other end said, Calvin, I want to come home. Ruby returned, and they spent the night together. The following morning, a significant change in Ruby's character was evident. She had become exceedingly clingy to Calvin, always desiring his presence, even when they were together. She missed him intensely, even in his presence. One day, while crossing the street, Calvin let go of Ruby's hand, which led to her breaking down in tears, and Calvin was unable to control her crying. Calvin went to his typewriter and typed, Ruby was filled with the most effervescent joy. Upon returning to the room, he found Ruby excessively jubilant, behaving strangely and bouncing on the bed with excessive happiness. After consulting with his brother, Calvin realized the extent of the wrong he had done to Ruby. He felt profoundly sorry for her. He wrote again, stating, Ruby was just Ruby. Happy or sad, however she felt. Ruby returned to her previous state, and Calvin took her to a party. There, Ruby conversed with another writer who was acquainted with Calvin. They spoke by the poolside and were about to swim when Calvin became furious, leading him to leave the party with Ruby. Back at their apartment, they began to argue. In the midst of their heated argument, Calvin uttered, I could make you do whatever I want. And he went to his typewriter to demonstrate his power to Ruby. Ruby packed her belongings and informed Calvin that she was leaving, suggesting they discuss it the next day. Calvin had already begun writing on his typewriter, and as Ruby attempted to leave, she encountered an invisible barrier. Terrified, she asked, what was that? Calvin revealed his writing about her. Calvin explained to Ruby that he had scripted her character and brought her to life through his writing, asserting, I can make you do anything, and you are not real. Ruby didn't believe Calvin, so Calvin began writing again to prove his capabilities. He made her speak French,
Papa will say,
snap her fingers uncontrollably,
Arrête!
strip and sing,
Dinky doo, I love you.
bark like a dog, and subjected her to various tortures.
I love your butt. I love your eyes. I love your... You're a genius. You're a genius.
At a certain point, the torment became unbearable, and Ruby collapsed. Calvin ceased writing and approached Ruby, feeling remorse for what he had done to her. Ruby ran away. Calvin resumed writing and made Ruby forget all the previous events. He wrote that Ruby was no longer his creation, she was free. The next day, when Calvin awoke, he realized that Ruby was gone. He attempted to forget everything and return to his normal life. He published his writing without disclosing any identifiable details about Ruby. His book became a tremendous success. While walking his dog in the park one day, Calvin unexpectedly encountered Ruby again, but this time she appeared to be an entirely new person.